arguments ultimately seem circular to me. God is good. Well, what is good? The things that God does in the Bible. God is loving. Well, what is loving? Well, the things that God gives us everything we need. What's the only thing we need? God. You know what I mean? So I want to get a perspective where that convinces me it's not a circular argument.
You bet. Okay. First point. I trust that you and I are not arrogant enough for you and for me to define good and then inform the world that they better live good lives. Because you and I, Matthew and Cliff, have defined what is good. And so all you guys in different cultures, you all got to buy into Matthew and Cliff's definition of good. That would be kind of elitist, ethnocentric, to put it mildly, right? So then the question is good real? And if so, who defines it? Okay? Now, if there is no God, then guess what, Matthew? There ain't no objective value of good. Why? Because Matthew and Cliff, and Tom and Susan, and Leopold, they all have their own definitions of what's good, and it's all relative. I'm not right, you're not right, Leopold's not right, it's all relative. But if there is a God who created Matthew with innate value, then it is good for me to respect Matthew, and it is evil for me to disrespect Matthew. Because if there is a God, then it's possible that this God created a value of goodness, a value of justice, and he gave you and me a conscience, and we better use our consciences in order to understand that real value of good and treat each other appropriately. That's where Jesus Christ enters the picture as being so key. Because you and I can't hear God audibly. You and I can't see God physically. So how are we going to know what God thinks? Jesus claimed to be God, revealing what God thinks. The evidence of the way he lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead is that Jesus is reliable. Matthew, if you die and rise from the dead, I promise to listen very carefully to everything you have to say, sir. Right? So it's this resurrection of Christ from the dead that convinces me that Jesus is reliable. Okay, does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. But still, there's examples in the Old Testament of wars and stuff that God ordained.
Yeah.
And so we're supposed to call that good. And then there's the sort of inactiveness that we can all sort of see of God in situations like tsunamis, which you talked about free will. I can punch someone or I can give them $20. Free will, I think, is irrelevant in the tsunami situation, in the terminal cancer situation and stuff like that. So, like, if I go to a doctor because I have terminal cancer and I say, hey, I have terminal cancer, and he doesn't do anything, I would not call that doctor a good doctor or a loving doctor, especially if he has the capability to. So, when I approach God and say, God, I have terminal cancer,
right,
and he has the ability to cure cancer, he has the ability to do everything he can think of, right?
Yep.
And he doesn't do that. I have a hard time saying that's good. And I do get the free will example, but I think this is separate from free.
Yes, it is. Good. Thank you for raising it. Stuart?
So if you're granting God to be an omniscient being, right, that's pretty high above us. If he's a transcendent, omniscient being, we need to grant him that omniscience, and we need to say our understanding, our knowledge is limited. Sure. So for me to tell an omniscient, transcendent God that I must know every reason for every piece of suffering in my life, is that a little absurd?
Absolutely, but isn't it absurd that God doesn't do anything when so many people die from cancer? And I get that is me, a non-God figure, saying God isn't good because of those things. But like, dude, let's get absurd. Let's do it. I think God can handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, that gets back to Genesis 1 and 3, right? God creates us, and there's a human fall with sin, and you have free will involved. So that's the narrative from the biblical understanding, right? But then if you look in the New Testament and you have Jesus, and the script of the Bible, if you look at it closely, Jesus is coming in, working for social justice. He's healing the sick, right? All of his miracles have a very purpose to them, very specific purpose. And what is that? To end up eradicating suffering, right? You don't see this in other religions. And again, how you're making the issue so complex, and you're how you're so disturbed by it, right? That's a very Western approach that you have to understand, and that's okay. I'm a Westerner too. And yet at the same time, okay, why is it disturbing you so much, right? What makes it wrong? That's what you got to grapple with as, I don't know if you're an atheist or not. But then getting back to your original question, the circular reasoning on God, and why do we really need God? I think St. Augustine answers this question well in his book Confessions. If you want to read it, I would encourage you to do so. He talks about disordered loves. So I'm from New Canaan, Connecticut, and I see this played out on a regular basis. You see parents loving their kids way more so than a transcendent God, and what happens when they love their kids more than anything else on earth?
Bad thing.
Very, very bad things, right? They're living vicariously through their children, so they're putting all kinds of pressure on their kids, and now all of a sudden we have a serious opiate addiction problem in my town and the surrounding county. You also have anxiety and depression that's through the roof, and there's a serious disorder in relationships as well. So the claim that the Bible is making is if you put God at the very top, right? If you understand that your primary love is from Him, then all these other loves fall into their proper place. And so you're not putting absurd pressure on your kids, right? Absurd pressure on your spouse, right? You're loving them. The Bible's claim is if you love God supremely, then you're going to love them well.
And I can definitely see the logic there, but you've made the assumption that God is loving without explaining to me why He is loving. And again, like, I don't think you've addressed the circular component of that.
Uh-huh. So
and maybe I'm just hearing you wrong.
Probably the hottest Russian philosopher out there right now, Zizek, talks about how the Christian understanding for love makes sense and should be followed more so than any other religion, right? And why is that? Because of the cross of Christ, he talks about. I don't know where specifically he's coming from, religiously speaking, but he makes this point that if you have someone dying on the cross for his enemies, and you base a society on that kind of self-sacrificial love, it's impossible not to have people following that model and loving each other in a very healthy way.
So you're convinced He is a loving God because of the examples, namely the sacrifice through Jesus.
That's one of the ways, yeah.
So that's one of the ways. So what about justice? And again, I get that it'd be arrogant for me to look at God and say I know more about justice, but I'm not doing that. I'm asking about justice. There are some things like the sending to someone to never-ending conscious torment for a finite number of years. To me, that doesn't seem like justice. And I know we can go through the sandbox analogy, and I can slap my teacher and then Obama and then, or Trump now, and then someone else, and the punishment gets worse and worse.
Good.
But it seems that's arrogance, not justice to me. And I don't want to come off attacking or something.
That's all right.
But to me, to say you go to never-ending conscious torment for all eternity because you lived here 21 years and you sinned and then you died, even though He is at the top, the only form of love, justice, the only form of love and justice I can see is, despite the fact that you're on top, still ultimately forgiving them time and time again, still ultimately loving them in the way that I can understand love, namely fraternal, maternal love. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to loving God supremely, understanding God's omniscience, and why we have to have Him at the top, right? So if you look at Luke 16, you have Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man is called rich, and he is in hell, right? He's just referred to as the rich man. I think there's a pearl of wisdom there to be mined, and that pearl is he has lost his very name. He's just rich man. So his very identity is stripped. It's the whole idea of born a man, born a woman, died a doctor. So you've lost your very humanity because you're just living for a certain job, another source of identity, right? And so hell, I think you got to be careful. I heard you kind of tie in different types of, again, works righteousness, right? You're talking about you sin a lot on earth and then you go to hell. Okay, that's totally not the biblical understanding. That's more of a cultural understanding of, a few different religions.
Right. And I get like Dante has a big thing on that. That's why I didn't say fire and brimstone.
Right.
I said never ending conscious torment.
But again, hell is based, the whole Christian understanding of faith is based on grace and love. And hell, you have separation from God. And it's not a matter, again, of God putting you in hell. It's simply you're living for something else. And you don't want a connection with God. And so it comes in to an understanding of, okay, do I want God to be supreme in my life or do I not? And what does that look like if he is supreme in my life? And so many of my atheistic friends are very kind, loving, moral people. And so for me to say, oh, just because they don't believe in God means they're absolutely going to hell, that's me playing God. That's me making a judgment on their life, which is absolutely absurd. So that's one, right? Another understanding that you got to think about when it comes to hell is, like you said, you got it Dante's Inferno, right? Dante's Inferno, it's constantly referencing hell as a certain depiction. So if you go into a museum and you look at a picture, a painting of hell and one of heaven, the one of heaven is going to be way more simplistic, right? You're going to have a baby playing a harp on a cloud. But then Dante's Inferno style painting, you're going to have real greed, you're going to have real evil taking place. They're very graphic paintings, right? And I think, again, that gets at this understanding of, okay, what happens if we do not accept faith, do not accept God, live separately from him, which are very individualistic lives turned in on themselves? What happens when we live those types of lives? Most likely, we will be more greedy. Most likely, we will be much more self-centered, egotistical. And that kind of thinking, that kind of lifestyle will be played out.
Okay. So that, I would say you've addressed love and justice. So what about the good part? So that's the thing that's most relevant to me. The reason I asked, my mother passed away this February because of cancer, and she was very much involved with Christianity and so on and so forth for a very long time. And I don't place any blame on God. I don't even have an anger per se, but I have a hard time saying God is good all the time and all the time God is good when in my mind he actively did nothing when a situation not having anything to do with free will or her own works, right? It was just cells didn't replicate the right way. I have a hard time saying that God is good in that situation. And it's fresh on my mind and stuff like that. So I'm probably not in the best mindset to have this discussion. But yeah, so not to get too personal, but try to convince me that even in that situation, God is good. And I don't want to hear, well, God can use this for good things. He already has. Absolutely.
Platitudes, right. You don't want to hear that.
But I can imagine a world in which good things happen and my mom's still alive, right? I mean, that's not hard to imagine.
Right.
So, yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I'll speak personally. You're speaking personally. First of all, I'm really sorry about your mom. And so from a family, personal perspective, my uncle lost his only daughter in a car accident when she was 7 years old, right? His biggest resource to help him through his suffering was Psalm chapter 88. David isn't sitting there when he is struggling with all kinds of depression, anxiety, when his very own kids are after him to kill him. He's not sitting there saying, oh, God is good all the time. God, you're good all the time. Absolutely not. He's attacking God verbally. And God's okay with it. God's not smiting him for that. So that helped my uncle, this absolute mind. He's the only one to have done a triple transplant in the state of Georgia, so way smarter than me. And yet, that was by far and away the best resource for suffering for him.